I'd like to welcome you all, students, colleagues, members of the Yaşar and wider academic communities, and the literary communities of Izmir and beyond. It's my particular honor and pleasure today to welcome the Rector of Yaşar University, Professor Dr. Murat Barkan, and to welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, Professor Dr. Behzat Gürkan. We're also expecting the participation of the British Consul General Istanbul, Mr. Lee Turner, who is himself an active writer. Again, it is also our great privilege to welcome our partners and guests from the British Council, including the Country Director for Turkey, Margaret Jack, Karen Brody, the Head of Arts, and Funda Küçük-Yılmaz, the Arts Coordinator from the British Council. I'd like to thank the distinguished members of the academic and literary communities who will be acting as chairs for the sessions today and tomorrow. Again, however, we are here in particular for the next 2 days to listen to and participate in the discussions among the acclaimed writers that we are fortunate to have here, representing the many different facets of contemporary literature. It's our pleasure to be hosting İnci Aral, Kerem Işık, Şebnem İşigüzel, Panos KARNEZIS, Sema KAYGUSUZ, Deniz Mayna, and Murat Uyurkulak. Okay, I'd like to mention just a couple of technical aspects connected with the conference. As you will see, there is a website appearing on the screen. Live broadcast is being made at the moment of these events, but also from the conference website, you will be able to access recordings of today's events. And you will also see addresses if you wish to participate in the ongoing Twitter discussions connected with the conference. Okay, it is my pleasure now. I would like to invite the Rector of Yaşar University, Professor Dr. Murat Barkan, to take the stage.
Great many thanks, Trevor, to take the responsibility of getting all the bureaucratic introductory speeches. I confirm, I second his good wishes and inviting wishes, what he said about the introductory speech. It's a great pleasure to have all of you from the other side of the sea, I mean Greece, but he's now survives in UK. And from the island, I mean UK, and from any part of the world, and the students and the press people. It's our pride to welcome you all to Yaşar University for the event of the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, organized by the Department of English Literature, Language and Literature, with the support of International Office. Patricia, she's a original Scottish, we call her Pat, simply. Thank you for your support and the partnership with the British Council, and Margaret is with us. And as Trevor just mentioned, we're expecting Mr. Lee Turner from the British Consul General in Istanbul in the coming minutes. We're happy to be hosting an event which not only involves the participation of academics and students from other universities in Izmir, but also we are confident will be of significance to the wider literary intellectual circles of Izmir and Turkey. Pat, it's so difficult for me to read these things, sorry. Since each event will also have a virtual and archival presence through audiovisual media and the internet, including video recordings promoted via Edinburgh Writers' Conference. We look forward to a healthy debate which will continue well beyond the confines of our conference sessions and held here today and tomorrow. In the meantime, this is out of the documents written and put in front of me. I was right from the starting period of this project. Why it is Edinburgh World Writers' Conference? And the climate just made me understand it. It is all raining, it is all dark. The best thing which could be done is to write and read simply. You cannot go out, just for a smile on your faces. The Edinburgh World Writers' Conference is a series of events focusing on a shared set of themes and organized around the world in the years 2012-2013. The first event took place in August 2012 at Edinburgh. This is the second reason why it is Edinburgh and the World Conference. It was first held in Edinburgh Book Festival and involves 50 international writers, and Izmir joins Berlin, Cape Town, Toronto, Krasnoyarsk. I'm so, incapable articulating Russian names. Forgive me for that. Cairo, simple. Jaipur, Beijing, Brussels, Port of Spain and Trinidad, St. Malo, Lisbon, Kuala Lumpur, and Melbourne as cities hosting the conference. The topics of the keynotes and subsequent panels at the conference are a national literature. I really wonder if a literature could be national in this limited the international scales. But the second topic is more understandable. The future of the novel is for inviting to me. The distinguished writers from whom we are pleased to welcome to Yaşar University to discuss these topics include 4 writers from Turkey, and the names have been mentioned already: İnci Aral, Sema KAYGUSUZ, Şebnem İşigüzel, and Murat Uyurkulak. Reinforcing the international element of conference, it is also our pleasure to welcome the Scottish writers Deniz Mina and Panos KARNEZIS. I'll call you Panos simply, from the other side of the sea, again, who was born in Greece and works in the United Kingdom. You're so lucky not being in Scotland. Keep Two of Panos KARNEZIS' novels are closely connected with Izmir and Aegean region. So understandable. I'm trying to write it for Izmir for years, not less than 6.5. Both books are available in Turkish, suggesting the increasing closeness and growing complexity of international literary and cultural connections. These things cannot happen alone. The realization of this event confirms the vital importance of the study of literature and understanding the complex nature of human connections. It is rapidly changing and rapidly globalizing world. Yaşar University, us, is very pleased, in accordance with its own values, to be a part of this debate, fostering the exploration of the vital links between these local, national, international, global connections, and especially looking at these connections as they are reflected in literature and the art of novel is in particular. Finally, to conclude, especially for those who's coming from UK, even from Scotland, I think they're feeling like home. And this is not Izmir, just believe me. It should be much warmer, but she arranged it for the psychological reasons. And so pleased you're here. I should recommend to spend some time in this city, not only on the campus, and get the inspiration of the city of Izmir, which we call the Pearl of Aegean Coast, if you don't mind. Thanks for coming. Glad you're here.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to ask to the stage Margaret Jack, who is the Country Director for Turkey of the British Council.
Çok teşekkürler. Thank you, Murat Bey, for your warm welcome, and your welcome also to the vibrant Pearl of the Aegean, to Izmir. The Edinburgh World Writers' Conference is part of a global conversation between leading writers from diverse languages and cultures. The city of Edinburgh is actually built on books. It's the home to the world's largest book festival and to the world's first professorship in English literature, which dates from 1762. So there is a long and tradition of writing, literature, and reading in the city of Edinburgh. I have to confess to being biased because it's also my home city. But it's fitting, therefore, that Edinburgh should find its Turkish host here in Izmir, a city that is so open to trade, so open to ideas, and indeed a province which gave birth to the epic poet Homer, to the Nobel laureate Georgis Seferis, to writer and journalist Attila İlhan, and to Turkey's greatest writer, female writer of songs, Sezen Aksu. So it's particularly fitting, therefore, for us to be for Yaşar University to be hosting an exchange of ideas and inspirations with aspiring writers among your students and professors who nurture and value creativity. And a warm welcome and introduction to Her Majesty's Consul General from Istanbul, Lee Turner. Thank you for joining us, Lee. I know you've been enjoying the delights of Izmir, albeit in the rain this morning. Thank you for joining us. This event celebrates the collaboration between arts and education in developing our creative leaders of the future. And the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference forms part of our 2-year programme in the British Council of literature events around the Turkey market focus of the London Book Fair in April 2013, the world's largest book fair for the selling of rights, the exchange of ideas, and the focus and the doing of deals in the publishing sector through the English language. Our program includes writers' residencies and exchanges. It's included the professional development of literary translators from Turkish to English, the fostering of business relationships between professionals in the publishing industry, and next month, we're absolutely delighted as the British Council to be supporting the single largest representation of 20 writers from Turkey to visit the UK, one of whom, Ince Hanım, is with us today. This is only possible by working together in strong relationships and partnerships that we enjoy both here in Turkey and in the UK. And I'd like to reiterate my thanks to Murat Bey and to his team, and all on behalf of the British Council and all involved in the Edinburgh World Writers' Conference. Writers connect people, writers connect cultures, they connect beliefs, and they connect us with ideas. And writers connect readers. We are readers, we are writers together today, and that's what brings us here today and tomorrow in a spirit of, I hope, enjoyable, productive, and stimulating exploration of ideas and connections. I look forward to enjoying the conference and hope you do too. Thank you. Çok teşekkürler. Sağ olun.
Hello. Oh, thank you very much. I would like to start by expressing my thanks for all the institutions and organizations who took place in organizing this event, British Council, Edinburgh World Writers' Conference, and Yaşar University. We are happy that such an intellectually stimulating and emotionally exciting event is taking place in our city, in Izmir, and in one of the young but thriving universities of Izmir, at Yaşar University. And also I would like to thank especially Dr. Trevor Hope for all the effort, thought, and time he put into the organization of this event, and his kind and gracious invitation he extended to Ege University, to our students and faculty members as well. The title and the topic of the panel, which will take place now, is National Literature. Before taking long, I would like to introduce the writers who are on stage with me right now. It's a great privilege for me to introduce Sema KAYGUSUZ and Panos KARNEZIS to you this afternoon. Sema KAYGUSUZ is a fiction writer of the young generation. She started her writing career publishing 3 collections of short stories, and she won very prestigious awards in Turkey with these books. Following her short story collections, her first novel, Yere Düşen Dualar, Prayers Falling on Earth, was published in 2006. And the novel was received very favorably, not only in Turkey, but also abroad by the literary and critical circles, and also received several prestigious awards. Her second novel, Yüzünde Bir Yer, A Place on Your Face, was published in 2009 and praised as it was called and praised as the literary Guernica. Yüzünde Bir Yer will be published in April of this year in France as well. Her latest narrative, called Kara Duygun, or Melancholic, was published last year, and it will be published in March of this year in Germany. One more thing about Sema KAYGUSUZ, she is also the co-author of the movie script of Pandora's Box, which won the 2008 The Golden Shell Best Film Award at the San Sebastian Film Festival. Before I leave the floor to Sema KAYGUSUZ, I would like to introduce Panos KARNEZIS as well. You have the translations, both Turkish and English translations of their presentations with you now. I think you have the photocopies of the speeches. If not, you should ask for them. Now, Panos KARNEZIS, he was born in Greece. You have already met him this morning in 1967, and he came to England in 1992. He studied engineering in England, and after graduation, he worked in industry for a while. Then he studied for an MA in creative writing at the University of East Anglia. His first book was published in 2002 called Little Infamies. It's a collection of connected short stories, a very interesting and attractive genre. He tried his hand first. And his second book was a novel called The Maze, which was published in 2004. It is a novel set in Anatolia in 1922. It was shortlisted for the 2004 Whitbread First Novel Award. Short stories by Panos KARNEZIS have been broadcast by BBC Radio 4 and have appeared in magazines in the UK and abroad. His novels, which followed The Maze, are The Birthday Party, published in 2007, and The Convent, published 2010. Presently, he lives in London, right? So after this introduction, I will leave the floor first to Sema KAYGUSUZ for his talk on the national literature, her approach to this idea, and then it will be Panos KARNEZIS' turn to respond to this topic, putting forward his interpretation, his understanding of the idea of the national literature. So the floor is yours, Teşekkür ederim. Önce davetiniz için teşekkürler.
First of all, I would like to thank
Böyle bir
for
konuda konuşuyor olmak,
invitation I received. It is
söylemek benim için büyük bir fırsat.
an opportunity for me to be able to speak in front of you on this very topic right now. I am amongst friends. Panos is here, and I would like to say welcome to Panos because he is, after all, a citizen of this very city.
Ulusal edebiyat,
I am going to speak about national literature. And
dilsel bir varlık olarak kendilik bilincine vardığı çarpıcı anlardan belki de en önemlisi başkasını dinlediği, başkasıyla söyleştiği anlardır. Söyleşiye katılan kişi sözcükler eşliğinde zamanı ve mekanı yeni boyutta yeniden kavrar. Dinlemek ve söylemek o sırada orada bulunmaktan öte, o sırada orada geçen sözle damgalanmaktır. Şimdi bu çok soyut gelebilir ama her birimizin birebir yaşadığı bir deneyim.
This may sound very abstract to you, however, this is a common experience to all of us. You listen to something that is being said, and the words become an emotional instrument, each one of them. It is not solely a means of communication, it is something that we can actually grasp. This is the act of engaging in a dialogue, and it is one of the only times when we become alive as a person or as the people. The incomparable German poet Hölderlin puts it like this in one of his verses, quote, "Man has learned much since morning and has named many forms in the sky. For we are a conversation and can listen to one another," unquote. So what are these forms in the sky, and what is this common source that induces us to hold a conversation? Is it a common spirituality or geography, a civilization that is common to us, a common culture, or is it our shared language? In my opinion, or if it were up to me, I would say that it is our common spirituality that makes us enter into conversation. And I'm talking about a common spirituality that transcends all other uniting factors such as language or country.
Ne zaman bir anlatının nesnesi olsa, aynı zamanda o anlatının mecazı haline de gelir. Ve edebiyat sadece insanı değil, dünyadaki bütün şeyleri anlamlı bir özneye dönüştürür. Anlatının nesnesi taş bile olsa, o taş kendi başına her şey olan bir taştır. İnsan nereye baksa, kendi özünü gördüğüne göre her yazar ya da anlatıcı aynı zamanda evrensel bir öze de dikkat çeker. Üstelik insan sadece diliyle değil, bütün varlığıyla söyler. Elleriyle, gözleriyle, bedenin dansıyla, inişi çıkışlı sesiyle,
the motion of their body, with the rising and falling cadence of their voice, and most importantly, they speak with their memory. Years ago, I went to a nightclub.
Panos, it's big coincidence. I began to talk about the Rhodos, a memory, my Rhodos Island. I didn't know a great writer will come, and it's big coincidence for me and also a surprise. Yıllar önce Yunanistan'ın güzel adası
Now I continue again with the translation. Years ago, I went to a nightclub on the beautiful Greek island of Rhodes, and it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and everyone in the club was drunk, they were dancing and enjoying themselves basically. And at one point, I went to the bathroom and met a woman crying at the sink. And as I was washing my hands at the sink, our eyes met, and the distress on the woman's face was very familiar to me. I knew that distress, and I knew those eyes. And our eyes met with the woman, and the woman immediately began speaking about what she had on her mind without drawing breath. And as you know, words are at the same time lyrics, and while listening to that woman, I not only heard the drunken slurring of Greek words, instead I heard a musical story of rhyming S sounds. And of course I couldn't understand the word of Greek, and the woman spoke all the time so quickly, and I didn't have an opportunity to tell her that I didn't understand any Greek. She just kept on talking. And in any case, within a few seconds, I realized that all she wanted and all she needed was to talk to a stranger, another person. And the woman's speech went on for minutes. And during these few minutes of demonstration with her voice full of bitterness, hurt, and disillusionment, I managed to make out, albeit falteringly, that her fiancé had bumped into his ex-girlfriend in the club and had lavished his attention on her, and that the ex-girlfriend, sensing the opportunity that had played up to this by flirting back. And the thing that the Greek woman and I had in common was not language at that time, but tone. And it was not words nor behavior, just the situation and the history of experience shared all up and down the Aegean coast. That was what inked onto our bodies, and that made us understand each other. So even if we had not had a real conversation in the classical sense, we had had a meaningful coming together. Just like reading a very well translated literary text, I was able to decipher her codes with my own cultural and linguistic codes. And the reason for my recounting this anecdote is to illustrate that translation is a natural act, and we've been talking about translation. We are engaging in a dialogue, and in a dialogue we are translating each other. And, I approach this subject matter from a semiological point of view, and translation therefore becomes an intellectual effort, and it is some kind of a letting go or a going off-road, if we may say so. So I sometimes wonder, given that we have the skill to translate, we can translate, whether there is a crumb of emotion left that in the world we haven't translated from one language to another. As Hannah Arendt said, the world is not human just because people came into existence, and it cannot be human simply because human voices echo within it. It only becomes human when it is the object of speech.
Söylemin nesnesi hangi yakarış, hangi inilti veya sevinç, hangi ilenç veya haykırış, bize gerçeği tahammül edebilme gücü veren hangi hikaye sadece çıktığı kaynağı, asılı ya da takılı kalmıştır. Çevrili çevrili dünyayı dolaşan hikayelerin canlı kalma gücü ortak ruhsallığımızdan ileri gelir. Ulusal edebiyat olarak çizilen çerçeve dil birliği açısından anlaşılabilse de bence hiçbir dil ulusla tanımlanamaz. Çünkü dil soydaşlara değil, topluluklara ait. Ayrıca dilin içinde farklı dillerden devşirme, söz dağarcıkları olduğu gibi
What is more, just as a language can contain repertories of borrowed words from other languages, so can it play host to other languages that have melded into each other. For example, within the structure of Turkish, for instance, there are realms of words borrowed from Arabic, from Persian, Greek, Kurdish, French, and English. On the other hand, there is no intellectual benefit to be gained from hiding powerful literary texts away in the drawers somewhere that are marked nationalistic
literature. However, at this point, I must
dünya
take
edebiyatına
one
eşsiz
precaution.
edebi
I
türler
personally have no
kazandıran Japon
objection to the
edebiyatı
lyrical
veya
lexical
ilk düz yazı
composition of
metinleriyle
Turkish literature
aslında roman
being
türünün
compared to
atası olan
Japanese
Çin
literature,
edebiyatı
which
gibi
introduced incomparable
tasniflere
literary
benim
genres
okur
to
olarak
world
bir
literature,
itirazım
for example,
yoktur.
or a comparison
Tam
to Chinese
tersine bu
literature doesn't
tanımlamaları
seem
çoğulluğun
inapt
ve
to me.
çeşitliliğin
Chinese literature being the
anahtarları
first
olarak
exponent of
görürüm.
prose and
Benim
essentially
için
regarded
itiraz
as the
noktası
as the
halkların
progenitor of the
edebiyatı
novel.
üstünden
To the
bir
contrary,
ulus
I see
tasarlamak.
these characterizations as being the
Edebiyatı
key to pluralism and
araçsallaştırarak
diversity.
toplum
And
mühendisliğine
what I do
soyunmakla
disagree
başlıyor.
with is, though,
Türk edebiyatının
is the
geçirdiği
idea
Türkçü
of a nation
yönelimler
being
tam da sözünü
incubated upon a
ettiğim
literature
toplum
as
mühendisliğini
once
kanıtlar
literature is made
niteliktedir.
into a vehicle,
Geç
the population
Osmanlı
begins
dönemi
to be drawn into
1908
social
Meşrutiyet
engineering.
hareketiyle birlikte
Turkish
edebiyatta
literature's
milli
departure into
kaynaklara dönmeyi
Turkism
ilke
is a
edinen
prime
adlı
example of the
adınca
social
milli
engineering to which I
edebiyat
have
diye bir
just
akım
referred.
doğmuştur.
And with the
Edebiyatta
1908
milli
constitutional
kaynaklara dönme
movement of the late
düşüncesiyle
Ottoman period,
ideolojik
an
olarak
out-and-out
güdülenmiş
national
bu
literature
yönelim,
movement was
dilde
born, which
sadeleşme,
adopted
aruz
as its
vezni yerine
principle
hece
the
vezni
intention to
kullanma,
take literature
yerli
back to its
hayatı
early
yansıtma
Turkic
gibi
origin.
milliyetçi bir
This departure,
perspektif
which was
sunar.
ideologically motivated
Bu
and
milli
based on the
hareketin
desire to
edebi
return
üretimleri
literature to
paradoksal
its
olarak
early national source,
Fransız,
heralded the
Rus ve
simplification of
İngiliz
language,
edebiyatının
the
etkisinde
replacement of the
kalmıştır,
aruz meter, for
yazılmıştır.
example, with the
Daha sonra
syllabic meter,
toplumsal
and tried to
sorunları
reflect
vurgulayan
local life in
sosyal
a
gerçekçi
nationalistic perspective.
edebiyatın yanı sıra
The literary efforts of this
1960'lı
nationalistic
yıllarda
movement
doğan
were
Türkçü
paradoxically
bir yönelim
influenced
var
by
ki
French, Russian,
o
and
dönem
English
yazılan
literature.
kitaplar
And later on,
Türkiye toplumunun
alongside the social
kolektif
realist
kimlik
literature, which
endişesini
highlighted the plight of
açığa
certain
vururcasına
communities, there came
Türklüğün
in the
kökenlerine odaklı
1960s
anlatılardan
more or less a
oluşur. Bu
departure
konuda
towards Turkism led
Murat
to the
Belge'nin
creation
çok
of
iyi bir
Turkic
incelemesi var.
root-oriented narratives,
Genesis,
recounting the
büyük
angst
ulusal anlatı
felt
ve
concerning the
Türklerin
population's
kökeni
collective
üzerine bir
identity.
kitap.
And at this point, I
1960'lı
highly
yıllardaki
recommend Murat Belge's
daha doğrusu
excellent work
yazarların
entitled
1960'lı yıllarda
Genesis,
çoğunlukla
Büyük
ürettiği
Ulusal Anlatı
Tarık
ve Türklerin
Kemal Tahir'in,
kökeni.
Ali
Genesis,
Karnas
The Great
Balıkçısı'nın
National Narrative and
Türkleri
the
kökenleştirmeye
Turks'
yönelik
origin or
edebiyatını
roots in its
bayağı
English translation. And
sağlam
it is a very
değerlendirdiği
substantial
önemli bir kitap.
analysis of
Herkese
the
salık veririm.
so-called
Zaten
roots,
tam
and
bu
I
noktada
highly
bir şey daha
recommend
söylemek
that book
isterim.
for everybody.
Edebiyat böyle
And
bir
I
büyülü
would like
sözcük
to
gibidir.
add yet another thing. When we
Neredeyse
say
kendi
literature,
kutsallığı
it
vardır.
seems
Çünkü
like
Türkçe'de edebiyat biliyorsunuz köken
an
olarak edepten
intangible
gelir.
word. And edebiyat,
bir
etymologically
mistik bir boyutu
speaking,
da
comes from
vardır,
the
içsel
Turkish
terbiyeyle ilgili.
word
Ancak
edep,
ben hala
which
hem de bir
means
yazar hem de bir okur
internal.
olarak Türk edebiyatının kendi kendini yeterince kritik ettiğini, kendi hesabına, kendi yüzleşmesini yapabildiği bir edebiyat ortamı olduğunu sanmıyorum. Türk edebiyatı henüz homofobiyle, Türkçülükle, dışlayıcılıkla, ayrımcılıkla, yani kendi içinde ürettiği bazı metinlerle tam olarak yüzleşmemiştir henüz. Kerime Nadir'in bazı metinlerinde kimi köylü insanlardan mağaralarda yaşayan insanlar olarak söz eder ve aslında bir azınlığı işaret eder. Bunun çok hesabını vermedi bana göre Türk Edebiyatı ama onu da eminim yakın bir zamanda tartışmaya başlayacağız. Umarım.
Has not been extensively discussed in Turkish literature yet,
az
for
önce
example.
1960'lardaki Türkleri kökenleştirmeye yönelik edebiyatta
we were talking about the 1960s.
Tarihi unsurları saptıran, hamaset dolu, başka milletleri aşağılayan bu akımın sığlığına ve gelip geçiciliğine rağmen nasıl kalıcı izler bıraktığını günümüzde görmek zor değil. Toplumumuzdaki Türk-Sünni eşleşmesinin zihinsel bir gen haline gelmesi, ölü alınamaz nefret, yabancı korkusu, etnik unsurlara ve azınlık dinlerine karşı takılan dışlayıcı dil ve düşmanlıkta bu dönemin güdümlü yazarlarının herhalde payı vardır. Neyse ki gerçek edebiyat ancak özgür ve özgün olduğu sürece canlı kalır. Onca zihinsel dayatmaya rağmen rağmen bugün güçlü bir Türk edebiyatı oluşmuşsa, edebiyatı taçlandıran bağımsız yazarların entelektüel haysiyetleri sayesinde olmuştur. Zamanı incitmekten korkmayan, katliamlarla yüzleşen, muhafazakar hassasiyetleri sırt çeviren, faşizme direnen, kültürün altını oyan, resmi tarih algısında yara açan, kimlik politikalarını alaşağı eden, her türlü cinsiyetçi, heteroseksist, homofobik düşünce biçimlerine karşı tetikte olan yazarlar sayesinde bugün hatırı sayılır bir Türkçe edebiyattan söz edebiliriz. Eğer biz bugün özgüvenle ve müdanasızca yazı yazabiliyorsak, vaktiyle yazıyı varoluşsal bir eylem olarak gerçekleştiren özgürlükçü yazar atalarımız sayesindedir. Kişisel olarak kendi yazarlık dinamiğinin kökeninden söz etmem gerekirse, doğal olarak ulusal edebiyat çerçevesinin dışına çıkmam gerekir. Zaten dünyanın bütün yazarları gerçekte vatansızdır. Ben de birçokları gibi teskin edilemez bir gurbetlik duygusu, sürgünlük kederi, dağdan koparılmış olmanın iç sıkıntısı, sıra düzen zamana ayak uyduramamaya içkin parçalanmışlık duygusuyla uyumsuzluk çekerim. Öte yandan belleksel bir varlık olarak kendime zihinsel bir çerçeve çizmeye kalkıştığım zaman Akdeniz havzasından Mezopotamya'ya, Orta Anadolu'dan, Orta Doğu'dan Anadolu'ya, geniş ve tarihsel olarak köklü bir coğrafyanın yerlisi olmaktan ötürü narsistik bir doygunluk duygusuyla teselli bulurum, kendimi avuturum. Kısacası kadim olan sayesinde yurtsuzluk duygusuna göğüs gerebiliyorum. Bu zihinsel coğrafya bütün semavi dinleri, temas ettiğim bütün Yunanlı tanrıları, Sümer'den kalan bütün mitleri, İranlı şairleri, Arap filozofları, Yahudi kabalistleri, Ermeni masallarını, denkbejlerini, Helen mimarisini, Zeytin ehli Rum çiftçilerin doğa bilgisini, Türkmen boylarının şamanistik geleneklerini, Çingene şarkılarını ve daha nice halkın melekelerini ve anlatılarını içerir. Gelin görün ki Türkiye'nin dışına çıkar çıkmaz yalnızca ve yalnızca Türk ve Müslüman bir kadın yazar olmakla işaretlenir. Bazı edebiyat ortamlarına sadece bu işaretle kabul edilir. Vurgu hep bu yöndedir. Sürekli İslamiyet konusunda sorulara maruz kalırım. Endonezya'daki Ubud Festivali'nde Arap masal kahramanı Simbad'dan söz etmemi isterler. Almanya'da İslamofobi tartışmalarına davet edilirim. Laiklik ilkesiyle tanınan Fransa'da Liberasyon gazetesinde Müslüman bir ülkede kadın olmak gibi son derece anti-laik bir yaklaşımı tartışmak zorunda kalırım. Mesele konu değil. Mesele bu konular aracılığıyla bir temsilciye indirgenmektir. Aşmam gereken sorulardan fırsat kalırsa avına atlayan bir kedi çevikliğiyle bir çırpıda kendi edebi anlayışından söz ederim. Türkiye'deki zihinsel kalıplar, ulusçu düşünüşün yarattığı dil alışkanlıkları, vasatlığın iktidar olduğu basitleştirici tutumlar, popüler kültürün kıyıcılığı, her gün uğradığım cinsiyetçi yaklaşımlar, yazarla okur arasındaki uçurum yetmezmiş gibi yurt dışında da sonu gelmez ön yargılar ve eksik bilgilerle donatılmış başka bir Türkiye algısıyla baş etmek zorunda kalırım. Diyeceğim, benim için ülke denilen mevhu içinde bir dert, dışında günbegün ağırlaşan bir kambur. Onu ne temsil etmek isterim ne de onun tarafından temsil edilmek. Hele ki dünyadaki bütün seyri halklardan halklara geçmek şeklinde algılayan biri olarak bir ülkenin sınırından başka bir ülkenin sınırına geçmek
that
benim
increases
için
day by day.
daimi bir
I do not want to be
hezimettir.
represented by it or
Tam
to
da
be
bu
its
noktada
representative. As a person
bir
who views all
pasaport ve
progress in this world
ancak
as a
bir
result
vizeyle
of
başka
people
ülkeye
traveling and
giriş yapan
discovering each
yazarın
other, I
her
still
an
feel repulsed
tehdit
when I
altında
have to
olan
pass from the border
bağımsızlığını,
of one country to the
bağımsızlık
border
derken
of another.
zihinsel
And at
bağımsızlıktan
this
söz
very
ediyorum.
moment, when a writer may
O
only enter
bağımsızlığı
another
tanımak
country with a
ve o
passport and
bağımsızlığa
visa,
saygı
we should
göstermek
recognize
bana
that their
göre basit
freedom
bir
is being
terbiye kuralı
threatened.
değil,
And I feel that
ahlaki
to
bir
respect
tutumdur.
that freedom is not just a
Yapıtını
simple
temsil
matter
eden
of manners,
sanatçıya
but it is
merkeziyetçi
instead a
ve
moral
tek kültürcü
stance.
bir
When you
çerçeveden
look through a
baktığımız
framework
zaman
of centralism and
görebileceğimiz
monoculture
kişi
at an artist
yalnızca
representing their
bir vatandaş
work, that
olacaktır.
person is just a citizen.
Bugünkü kapitalist, postmodern
The
sistemin
lifestyle
bütün
propounded
dünyanın
by the
yerlilerine
postmodern
önerdiği yaşama
capitalist
biçimi
society of today to
aslında
all
sadece
inhabitants of the world
vatandaşlık
is nothing
kurumudur.
more than an institution made
Dolayısıyla
up of citizens.
sanatçıyı dolaşıma
Therefore,
sokan
all the
bütün
warm
kurumların,
democracies,
yayın
the
evlerinin,
author
editörlerin,
encounters, such as
kültürlerin ve
publishing
sanat
houses,
ideologların,
cultural and artistic
akademisyenlerin,
ideologists,
samimi demokratları
editors
bugün
and
yaşamsal bir
academicians do
önem
in
taşıyor.
fact have
Kabul
life-sustaining
etmeliyiz
meaning.
ki rastladığımız bütün
We have to
güzellikler
accept
kuşkulu.
that all beautiful things we
Devletler
encounter
edebiyat
are
çevirileri
to be
için fon
viewed
ayırıyor.
with suspicion.
Resmi
The state
bakanlıklar
is setting
sinemaya
aside funds
destek
for
veriyor.
literary translation.
Uluslararası
Official
organizasyonlar
ministries are
devasa
supporting the
kültür
cinema.
projelerine yatırım
International
yapıyor.
organizations are
Yüksek
investing
sosyeteye
in
hizmet
enormous
veren
cultural
giyim
projects,
firmaları
and haute
sanat
couture
galerileri açıyor ve
companies are
böylece
opening art
aslında
galleries.
her
In this
yaratıcı
way, all
eylem
artistic endeavor is
çerçeveleniyor,
being taken under
kontrol altına
control.
alınıyor.
The artist who throws
Vatandaşlık
his lot
tabiyetiyle
in with the system
sisteme
as a
paçasını kaptıran sanatçı,
citizen is being
duymak
invited into a
istediğini
role
söyleyen
as a
uzlaşmacı
conciliator
bir role
who says
davet
what
ediliyor.
they want to hear.
Huzursuz etmeyecek
These
ölçüde yaramaz,
artists, who are not too
sempati
badly
duyulacak
behaved to
kadar
make people
çılgın,
feel uncomfortable,
makul
are
ölçüde
deluded enough to
deli
inspire
sanatçılar.
sympathy and
Çağımızı
are
tehdit eden
insane in
işte
an almost
bu
sane
gizli,
way.
çok sinsi
So this hidden
evcilleşmedir.
domestication is
Ulusla
what really
başlayıp
threatens our times.
vatandaşlıkla
A
tamamına
domestication that
eren bir
begins with the
evcilikten söz
nation
ediyorum.
and comes to fruition
Ancak
with citizenship.
hatırlamalıyız ki
However, we have to remember
Afganistan'da
that
yağmalanan
if
arkeolojik eserler
artifacts plundered from
bir
Afghanistan
Avrupa
are
şehrinin
being
müzesinde
displayed in a
sergileniyorsa
European European museum,
uluslararası
this means
savaşların
that the
gölgesi
shadow of
düşmüş
international
ve
war
düşecek
has
demektir.
fallen on every
Tam
treasure
da bu
and will
noktada
continue to do so.
sanat taşıyıcısının
At this very
haysiyeti
point, the
sanat
dignity of the
nesnesinin
creators of
güzelliğinden
art are
çok
far
daha
more
elzemdir.
indispensable than the objective
Hölderlin'in
beauty of
emanet
art.
ettiği gibi
If we are to continue to
göksel
name the
şeylere ad
celestial
vermeye devam
objects as
edeceksek,
Hölderlin entrusted us
önce
to, then
haysiyetimize
first we
sahip
must
çıkmalı,
stand firm in our
daha sonra
dignity,
biz
and then we
hepimiz
must, all of us
hep
together,
beraber
be the very
diyaloğun ta kendisi
conversation
olmalıyız.
itself.
Dinlediğiniz için
Thank you
teşekkür
very
ederim.
much for listening.
Thank you very much for this stimulating talk. And now the floor is yours, Panos.
Thank you. Thank you, Selma. Just a few notes on national literature. They slightly overlap, just a couple of points with Selma. National literature, Goethe famously said, does not mean much at present. It is time for the era of world literature, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach. It is a strong statement, all the more impressive for it having been made more than 180 years earlier. But one should not rush to assume that Goethe was speaking against the existence of national literatures and in favor of a universal sort of such, whatever the latter might mean. Rather, he was expressing the hope that the introduction of literatures from across the world through translation would create a body of texts which would be read and studied much more widely than each national literature on its own. One has to say, of course, that inevitably there would always be, and why not, literary works that heavily draw upon historical, political, and cultural references, so that they are meaningful only to members of the originating culture or to those specializing in that culture. Such works cannot transcend the realm of national literature, of course. But what is national literature? T.S. Eliot, reluctantly it has to be said, tried to define American literature once and came up with two necessary features which he believed must both be present in a landmark work of national literature, that is, a strong local flavor and an unconscious universality. To his credit, Eliot avoided defining national literature in terms of the so-called national characteristics, the values, norms, and customs which people of the same nation typically hold, their emotional responses, their morality. In any case, he argued that the work of a truly national author, and he singled out Poe, Whitman, and Twain as American examples of such writers, it is inseparable from its physical setting, even though it deals with universal themes. It is an instinctive definition, for one still connects nationhood with land, even though this has ceased being the case, at least since the age of mass migration from the middle of the 19th century until the first decades of the 20th. Well, one can hear Conrad turning uncomfortably in his grave, and we should hurry to reassure him, to the consternation, I'm told, of many a Polish academic, that as far as his books are concerned, he is an English author, despite such works as Almayer's Folly or Nostromo, which are set outside the dominions of the British Empire of the time. He is in good company. Indeed, Othello is neither set on British soil, nor are its characters English. But I do not think any member of this audience would hesitate to call Shakespeare an English writer and Othello an English play. One can go on, coming up with name after name which resists a straightforward definition of a national writer. Does Nabokov's work belong in Russian literature or the American one? How about Max Siebold, the late German writer who lived in England, wrote in German, but achieved his international recognition through his English translations? Or the Chinese Ha Jin, who moved to America as an adult, and his books are written in English, but are mostly set in China? Or Milan Kundera, a Czech writer who lives in France and has been writing in French now for quite some time? Such examples of mongrel, for want of a better word, writing are becoming even more common as a growing number of well-off, middle-class, educated people move abroad, not out of economic necessity, but to study further or get well-paid jobs. It is essentially migration as a lifestyle choice, and some of those people often have the skills and time that allows them to try and write. It is happening in Britain too, of course, but one should not think of the emergence of innovative multicultural literature there as a consequence of the immigration into the country which happened in the late 1940s and the 1950s. In fact, a look at the British citizens who have been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature shows this assumption to be false. Kipling was born in India, Yeats was Irish, as was Shaw, Eliot was an American, Churchill's mother was American, Elias Canedy was a Bulgarian Jew, Heaney, Irish, Naipaul from Trinidad, Harold Pinter's parents were of Jewish Eastern European ancestry, and Doris Lessing was born in Persia and grew up in Rhodesia. In fact, only 3 writers on the list, that's Goldsworthy, Russell, and William Golding, would fit the narrow, outdated definition of being English. So if local setting is not a necessary requirement for defining a national literature, what other criteria could there be? Could it be language? Well, let us consider Kafka, who wrote in German, but was the subject of the Habsburg Empire until its dissolution, and then of the Czech Republic. As far as the Czechs of his day were concerned, he, along with all the German-speaking minority of Prague, were simply Germans. But among the Germans of Prague, people like Kafka were thought of as Jews. Today, I believe he's considered to be rightly a German writer. So perhaps the language criterion is getting us somewhere, but we have to tread carefully. Like Sema mentioned earlier, languages have international varieties, and within each variety there are regional dialects too. Of course, there are countries with more than one national language, like Switzerland or Canada, for example. So one cannot define the national literature solely on the basis of a formal written language. Quebecois literature and the French branch of Swiss literature could not be said to be subcategories of French literature, that is, of French national literature. And we should also remember that national boundaries often take precedence over linguistic differences. For example, Cantonese and Mandarin are often classified as dialects of the Chinese language, even though they are more different from each other than Swedish is from Norwegian. In the English language, the term nationality may either refer to citizenship of a sovereign state or membership of an ethnic group. And it seems to me that this duality hints at a way to define national literature through a combination of political and cultural criteria. Literary tradition has to be taken into account, of course, but that is, the literary predecessors whose work has informed and shaped a writer's work, but also history, religion, politics, anything really that influences the development of ideas. A national literature must reflect the multitude of diverse voices, many originally from other countries, and the plurality of ideas, themes, and perspectives that can be found at any given time in a modern nation. When does a national literature become nationalistic? That's something that Sema mentioned also, and I listened to her with great interest. I suppose the danger is there in both large and small nations, but larger nations have at least the self-confidence to allow their writers to choose their settings and themes, while smaller nations cannot afford to be so generous, let's say. Kundera explains it thus. Small nations hold worldly culture in high esteem, but feel it to be something alien, a sky above their heads, distant, inaccessible, an ideal reality with little connection to their national literature. The small nation instills in its writer the conviction that he belongs to that place alone. To set his gaze beyond the boundary of the homeland, to join his colleagues in the supranational territory of art, is considered pretentious, disdainful of his own people. And since the small nations are often in situations where their survival is at stake, they can easily present this attitude as morally justified. It's not hard to guess that Kundera's shrewd remarks stem from his own experience. The fact that he's a naturalized French citizen and is no longer writing in Czech puts for many his moral authority in doubt because he's not thought as writing for a specific ethnic minority. It is a situation which many of us who live abroad and write in a foreign language would recognize. So be it. In the biblical tale of the Tower of Babel, the people of the earth, who up until that time all spoke the same language, decided to build a city with a tower that would reach to heaven. Their intention, besides earning great fame for such a remarkable feat, is to prevent themselves from being scattered over the face of the earth, but live and prosper together. God, however, sees this and reflects that if as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. So he makes them speak many different languages, and the people, unable to understand each other anymore, are scattered to the four winds, each language group going its own way. So it seems to me that as writers and readers, writing and reading in a multiplicity of languages, but being able to understand each other through widely available translations, were the children of the builders of Babel, who yearn to return home and pick up where our fathers left off, and build a tower that would unite us again. Only that this time it would not be made out of bricks, but something indestructible, words. Thank you.
Thank you very much. After hearing the talk of our writers, now the floor is open to your questions and comments. Murat Bey, buyurun.
This pause will be in Turkish, sorry.
Türkçe soracağım. Kulaklık kullanmak isteyebilirsiniz dolayısıyla.
Öncelikle size oturum başkanı ve değerli yazarlarımıza, hepsini yazarlarımız olarak kabul ettiğim için değerli yazarlarımıza katkılarından ötürü teşekkür ediyorum. Sanatkarın ya da bir sanat ortamında konuşmanın, bir fikir ileri sürmenin ne kadar zor, tehlikeli ve riskli olduğunu bilenlerdenim, bir iletişim bilimci olarak. Sınırlayan ve sınırları zorlayan bir sanat anlayışında destekçisi olan bir kişi olarak görüyorum kendimi. Ancak bu noktada insanları bir araya getiren, bunları isterseniz ulus deyin, ister vatan deyin, adını ne korsanız koyun ve birçok şeyini yitirdikten sonra kendini güvenli bir ortamda hissetme gibi son derece insanca bir ihtiyaçtan yola çıkan ve burada bir arada olmanın mutluluğunu, kıvancını, enerjisini önce kendinde yaratıp sonra etrafına yayarak bir arada olmanın, insan olmanın ve kendini güven içinde hissetmenin bir yansıması olarak ulusal bir söylemi olan yazarları çok mu dışlamalıyız ya da bunlar çok mu zararlı? Sözünüzdeki ifadelerdeki şeyden bir tepki olarak değil, ancak ulusal yazara, ulusal yazma ihtiyacına bu kadar mı karşı olmalıyız? Bir dünya vatandaşı olmayı hissettiğimiz bir noktada. Sanırım bu konuda biraz konuşmacılarımızın söylediği, dile getirdiği söylemi tersi yönde biraz daha zorlayarak onları da konuşmaya teşvik edeceğimi umut ediyorum. Teşekkür ederim. Sağ olun.
Böyle bunu düstur olarak, bir kural olarak dışlamalıyız diye ben öyle bir zihinsel yasa koyamam. Koymamak gerektiğini düşünürüm. Sadece şunu hatırlatmak isterim. Güdümlü yazar, sadece benim konuşmamda sözünü ettiğim Türkleri kökenleştirmeye yönelik milli edebiyat çerçevesinde yapılan edebiyattın bir başka karşılığı Çekoslovakya'da da var. Çarlık Rusya'sı dağıldıktan sonra Rus edebiyatında da var. Alman edebiyatında var. Ama biz o yazarları hatırlamıyoruz zaten. Canlı kalmıyor metinleri. Çünkü güdümlü olan metin sadece ideolojik olarak siyasi
or ideologically laden texts only because they serve a purpose other than literary, they cannot really survive throughout the ages. We still talk about Yusuf Atılgan, Oğuz Atay, or Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, or Sevgi Soysal in Turkey. We keep reading those names, Orhan Kemal, Sabahattin Ali. If we still read those authors, it is only because they were free, they were independent. They were in their locality, but they embraced the entire world. The word universe or universal is a little bit problematic, but I could call them earthlings because they embrace the entire earth as it is. I think the dynamics of literature cannot be framed by national boundaries. But of course they become meaningful in a certain locality or local context. Well, I mean, you cannot limit your imagination to the boundaries of Turkish nation state. I have Arabia, I have Mesopotamia, I have, you know, all these geographies in my cultural DNA. So instead of restricting myself to national boundaries, I could set out with a broader imagination and embrace the world as such. This is my personal, very personal choice. But this is also what I learned in my literary experience. Thank you.
I don't think there's an artistic reason why a certain work of literature has to be, international, has to kind of transcend the national borders. I can't think of one. Earlier I don't know if you were here this morning, we sort of we raised the same issue. Of course, it's our choice as writers to to have a wide audience. But I can imagine people who are writers who are just happy to to write for a local audience, and so that means that they write with other things in mind, with very specific references, which an international audience won't be able to understand. Not because of the language that it's written in, but because of those historical realities, those social, whatever cultural issues that really say nothing to a foreign reader. And why should it do that? So that we shouldn't force sort of a writer to do either, to go in one direction or the other. The objection is that when people who want, and it's usually people who want to do the, to transcend the borders, that they sort of run into trouble. That's my impression anyway. And that usually happens, like I said, it usually happens with the smaller states because of the history they have and because of their identity. And you can imagine writers from the ex-British colonies. They write in a language which, of course, they acquired because they were part of the empire. They write in English, so they don't have, usually they don't even write in the whatever old language before the of whatever 300-400 years before, but they write in English, so they have in a way compromised themselves already. So I can imagine how suspicious their compatriots are when they see them achieving a kind of international following, as having betrayed their people. And that happened with writers like Tagore, for example. Perhaps he's still academics or writers who consider him as kind of betraying his Bengali ancestry because he became such an international figure. But the fact of the matter is that he probably did more for Bengali literature than many others who sort of stayed physically and literally in the area. So I agree with you that writers should do what they want to do. And perhaps there are merits in either approach. I mean, maybe later on, the way international, with whatever the exchange of information that we have these days, it's not comparable to what was happening 100 years ago. Maybe the very local, in a few years, will be as easily understood as the international. Someone living in a small African country can be his lifestyle and his habits will be as easy to grasp for someone from Western European background. Something that was not happening in the past.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I would also like to thank our participants today, both our speakers and the chair. I'd like to ask a question. Benedict Anderson has a very celebrated book called Imagined Communities, in which he argues that historically, with the rise of print culture, or what he calls print capital sometimes, the possibility of national audiences, and therefore in many ways the possibility of national community came into existence. And his argument is that actually the novel played a particular role in that. He thinks that the rise of the novel is specifically connected with the rise of the possibility of national communities. I wondered, in what we're told is the age of globalization, whether you think that literature in general, or the novel in particular, still serves those kinds of functions. Is there any way in which the novel or literature in general has been relieved of that kind of burden or that kind of responsibility? Is literature in the process of globalization taking on different ideological burdens and responsibilities? Or is it not literature? Is it other media, including film, that actually are taking on some of the historical and ideological tasks that have been played by literature, and perhaps the novel in particular?
Sizin sorunuz bayağı bir edebiyat sosyolojisine giriyor.
Your question really digs into the realm of literature and sociology. And this is why I can only answer your question intuitively, and I will just touch upon the subject matter.
Bir tür ürküntü duyuyorum. Günümüz sanatçısının
feel some sort of an anxiety, and I've been talking about the domestication of today's artists in my speech, and by that I mean that we now have artists that say what we want to hear, because we have institutions and organizations that take care of art matters, and a market, there exists an art market, and somebody, or in particular the artists or the writer who wants to enter into that market, who wants to become a part of that market, needs to cater to the needs and the needs of the representatives of those institutions, and he basically has to say what has to do what they want. And I'm afraid of the word or the expression nation, because since the First World War, because of that very word, millions of people have died. I therefore prefer the word communities, and I feel much more inclined to use that word. And going back to Yaşar Kemal, when he talks or writes rather about the Turkish communities or the Turkish people, he really incorporates all the cultural aspects of a society, or Borges, for example, does more or less the same. So the question we need to ask ourselves is whether or not such a visual literature will survive. The artist who withstands all the so-called pressures will be able to create that literature, and he will be able to sustain that literature. So the artist needs to show stamina and the power to read.
I don't think that literature is going to die, or that some other medium is going to take its place. I mean, of course, film and other art forms will, always be there and take perhaps a greater chunk of that pie, because they're easier for the audience to consume it as an art form, if you like. But perhaps that's a discussion for tomorrow about the future of the novel. But it seems to me that the written word it stands to a greater variety of interpretation than film anyway, which cannot be very abstract, like like painting or sculpture. But there is a danger. I mean, I haven't thought about it really until now that you asked the question. It seems to me there is a danger that world literature, will come to be something like world music, which strikes as very anodyne. It's not it's something that you listen at, in the supermarket, like easy listening or something. And I suppose there is that danger. Literature survived very well in the age of, in the old days of no cross-border communication, if you like, and you had Russian literature and their masterpieces, and you have, Japanese and American and European, German, French, whatever literatures. it is a danger. I can see it myself, you know, being living abroad and trying to write, and of course you want to write the things you want to write, but it's inevitable that you're thinking on different terms now. You're thinking, you know, the whole equation has changed. You're thinking about potentially wider audience, and how are you going to grasp that? It's only human that you want to do that, and it's not a matter of money, but it's a matter of, you know, of approaching a wider audience, and I can see the danger being there, that you're trying to second guess the reader, and it's bad enough trying to second guess the, you know, the British reader or the Greek reader, but trying to do that and at the same time to include the Russian or the German or the Japanese reader, that can easily result in writing something very, you know, something very, let's say, not very challenging, I think. It can be done. I mean, you've seen writers with their national following, which are great writers. I don't know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez or Jose Saramago. He was, and didn't seem to me, didn't strike me that he was trying to gain an international audience, but he did without having to compromise anything. But the danger for the lesson writer, like ourselves, is still there.
Thank you. Yes. Other questions?
Belki bir soru değil ama bir.
Well, I don't have a question, however, I'd like to make a contribution.
Tabii ki siz edebiyatı ticarileştirirseniz,
if you commercialize literature, then you need to cater to what's being asked of you by the ones in power. However, if people have managed to create literature in harsh times, in difficult times, and literature survived after all, then literature of our times will survive as well. It may be difficult, but literature has overcome very tedious and harsh times. And as long as writers keep creating literature, it is an act of creativity, literature will survive. But in the commercial sense, of course, even literature may die. And I therefore do not think that literature should be discussed as an art form, not as a commodity or with any sort of commercial indications. Yes, but we've been not discussing literature as a commercial entity. Commerce or trading literature is something entirely different. The gentleman is not using his microphone. We cannot hear him in the booth. The gentleman needs to use his microphone. We cannot hear him and therefore cannot interpret. We're sorry.
I think one thing that I personally and honestly would like to ask of you is whether there exists a certain aspect of language that is really specific to one's culture and is almost untranslatable. If I refer to Miss Sema's speech, there's this part of her speech where she says, I sometimes wonder, given that we have the skill to translate, whether there is a crumb of emotion left in the world that we haven't translated from one language to another. And this is very interesting for me because when I come from Singapore, there's a particular way in which we speak English where we add sounds like la or lo or ah for that matter at the end of each question and sentence, just as a way of speaking to one another. And it's something which I personally feel which only Singaporeans can understand and appreciate. And although there may exist language and literature that is universal, there's also certain aspects to writing and literature that is really specific to a culture that is personally impossible in my opinion. So I'd just like to hear what you have to think about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
düzeltme yapmam gerekiyor.
Well, I need to correct something.
Meselesini tamamen ontolojik olarak ele aldım.
I have discussed the matter of translation from an entirely ontological point of view, how we grasp it. There is a very valuable writer, Pissoir, who says the following, quote, "In order for myself to be able to convey certain words, expressions, etc., to somebody else, I internally translate them inside of myself. And inside me there exists a spirit that hurls or screams or cries or gets angry, and then I let that spirit out. However, some bits and pieces get lost in translation. And when I ask whether we have translated everything until now, I mean this. I talk about the moment of engaging in a dialogue where we translate, do an internal translation, the one I just have outlined, and then we translate the words of our counterpart. And of course there are certain words or expressions that are very difficult or even not possible to translate. For example, the Turkish word gönül or the word gurbet, for example, in Turkish. And these words become or have become parts of the playground that we call translation, more or less. But I've been referring to translation as an ontological entity in my speech, just to be clear.
I don't know. For me, literature is about ideas, really, and ideas can be translated in any language. I don't obsess about words. I don't know. I know writers, great writers, James Joyce and whatever. They were really obsessed about words and this and that. But for me, it's just a tool. It maybe just a consequence of me having lived abroad and having to use language as a tool to communicate. That it doesn't. Words don't hold. They're not really sacred to me. So what you say, and I'm sure that from a whatever sociological, anthropological point of view. Singaporean English is very different from Australian or the Queen's English or Canadian. But for me as a reader, that doesn't matter really. I'm more interested in the ideas that a Singaporean writer has to present and the way he or she sees the world. So we agree that some things get lost in translation, but I think what we gained is much more than saying that, okay, this wine doesn't travel well, so we're not going to try it. I suppose that's it.
I think we still have time for a couple of more questions.
Could I just ask? Sorry. When you're talking about national literature, in Scotland it's a big issue. We're voting on independence from the UK next year, and discussions about identity are incessant. And trying to be universal and speak to everybody in the world at the same time, for me, I grew up everywhere, like lots of writers. I grew up everywhere, and I feel that I'm part of everywhere. And for me, writing about somewhere like Scotland is about being situated and not about being nationalistic. And I think a lot of people read writers from a specific place to try and understand that situation. And moving away from language, which is a big issue in Scotland, because even when we're speaking English, quite often people can't understand what we're saying. And there are a lot of Scottish words that are Gaelic, and a lot of Scottish words that are Old Irish, and that you can't translate them. But I wondered if you could talk about story forms, which I think there are very specific Scottish story forms, and I think Scottish storytelling comes much more from an oral storytelling tradition than a written storytelling tradition in the way that classic English literature comes from. I wondered if you could talk about your situations and how that's affected your story forms.
I haven't thought about that really ever. It's very interesting to say that it goes back to the how you define the national literature, that you shouldn't just go by the language, or definitely shouldn't go by the, by the borders of a sovereign state. I don't know what I can say about that. I'm trying to think about my Greek experience, of me coming into English language from a different background. And I can think that perhaps poetry is, at least up until recently, was considered proper art form in Greece. You know, we have two Nobel laureates, and they're both poets, Seferis and Elitis. So I suppose, like in many other literatures, words matter more than the actual story in Greek literature. That's perhaps one of the reasons why Greek literature doesn't travel well either. A lot is lost in translation, and a lot is about that sort of kind of, about the sound and the give and take, on dialogue between characters and so on, and not the actual story itself. I don't know what Sema can say. I suppose it depends on the. That transcends the sort of level of literature in a narrow sense, in the meaning that we have to consider the way that stories propagate in different countries, and there is a tradition, and I don't know, maybe there are flyers in other countries. There are stories sold in books sold at stalls in Latin America, and they get copied. And it's interesting with the e-book how anyone can really edit that and hack it and edit the actual novel and then put it up on the internet under the name of the writer, and it can easily not be the writer's original novel. So I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting discussion tomorrow about the future of the novel. But like you said, we're talking about these national issues, national literature, and so on. And there is a kind of an emerging, shall we call it, nation of stateless people who, by choice or otherwise, they decided to live elsewhere. And it seems to me like they occupy the kind of no man's land between states, and they have a voice too. But they don't have it seems to me that they don't have a kind of a physical, place where to exist. They only exist in the pages of a book, the experience. And I feel like that myself. I wrote about Greece, or my understanding of Greece in the beginning, but that's sort of out of the way now, and I got it out of the way, and now I'm more interested in writing not about England, but about other places, the places that I go and I travel and this and that, and I often wonder, like Kundera, do I have the kind of a moral authority to write a book, or I'm just a hack? But I suspect we'll see more of that, of a kind of stateless writer who would write for much more internal reasons, as opposed to expressing a kind of an identity, a national identity, or whatever. I don't know what Sema has to add to that.
Siz sözlü kültürle ilgili bir şey söylediniz.
Well, you mentioned oral history or oral narratives, and that Scottish literature has evolved from that oral tradition. And the use of words and the oral tradition is very widespread and very well embedded in Turkish literature as well. However,
sizin bu İskoç edebiyatı
you
için
referred to
yaratmaya
Scottish
çalıştığınız
literature
ortam
And the space that you're trying to create for Scottish literature is being done in Turkey as well with respect to Kurdish. For example, Shakespeare is being translated into the Kurdish language. Or we've been digging up Armenian writers that used to write in Turkish, and those manuscripts and books come to the surface right now. So the word in itself, words in itself, have been highly praised up until now.
Kanuni Sultan Süleyman kendi oğlunu boğdurduğu
We have the concept of praisals, for example, in Ottoman.
Monark,
the Sultan,
ne kadar ileri gitmiş.
A tyrant, the monarch, has drowned his own son. Think of that cruel act. However,
Şehzade Mustafa için bunlardan biri de
look at how many
şu şeye bakın, yani bugün demokrasi vesaire gibi şeylerle açıklayamayız bu durumları ama edebiyatın ortamına bakın, bana çok ilginç gelir. Bir yüzbaşı padişahı eleştiren bir mersiye yazıyor ve onu çekiyorlar bir kenara. Yahya.
And Yahya,
bir şey Yahya'ydı, unuttum.
I forgot.
O dönem Kanun döneminde birkaç tane Yahya var çünkü
there were a couple of Yahyas during the time of Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent. And I don't know how the interpreter is going to
ölürken de biz öldük. O ölürken de biz öldük. Onu öldürürken de biz öldürdük. Her iki durumda da kendini tanımlıyor. Sonra Türkçe'de yazılı olarak Türkçe diyoruz aslında Osmanlıca'ya, biliyorsunuz. Yani 15. yüzyılda Fatih'in dinini hepiniz anlarsınız. Biraz sözlüğe bakmanız gerek. Ama bayağı bir Türkçedir yani.
Of a dictionary, really, but you would be able to understand 15th century Ottoman Turkish. There are the Şehrengiz manuscripts, for example.
Masal anlattıkları gibi rüya metinlerini de yazmışlar.
Have jotted down their dreams, and they became these Şehrengiz manuscripts. So in Turkey, or in the Turkish geography, the oral tradition and the written tradition can be called equals or have received equal importance.
Dolayısıyla biz bunları hatırlatınca şimdi Mersi'ye inşallah burada birkaç kişinin içine merak ateşi düşer de internete girip Yahya'nın Mersi'sini okur. Muazzam bir metindir, muazzam bir yaz metnidir.
Era of internet, etc. For example, everybody has the possibility to Google Yahya's elegy manuscripts and have a look at what they were all about. And mind you, we do have female poets in the Ottoman times, 38 of them, and I cannot recall any female poet with respect to European history, for example.
Yani önemli olan yaratmak da değil, biliyor musunuz? Olanı mirasa sadakatle, şefkatle, merhametle ve demokratça sahip çıkmak.
Heritage, what already existed before you, and you need to praise it and you to value
demokratlık ve bu şefkat.
So what we need is tolerance and compassion and democracy.
Hello, hey. Şimdi bu tarihsel miras konusuna
Well, about this historical heritage, as you rightly put, I wonder what you think about the heritage, the historical heritage. You know, the Turkish alphabet reform of 1928 and the purification campaign of the Turkish language. What do you think about that? Was it a repudiation or rejection of the historical heritage? Wasn't it a form of social engineering?
Yani zaten
This is how I see
siz
it.
sorarken
And I think you've already answered the question yourself.
Acaba kaybedilen neler
Yeah, I
yani?
know,
Kaybedilen
but what
şeyler.
did we
felsefe,
lose
çünkü
in this
Türkçe
process?
bir eylem dilidir.
Actually, Turkish is
Türkçe'de
a
3-4
language of
tane
action.
fiille bir araya gelerek
Normally
bir
you
cümle
combine a
kurabiliriz.
couple of verbs in
Bunu
Turkish
da
and then you can
çevirmesi kolay
actually
olur
make
mu
up a
bilmiyorum ama
sentence. I don't know if it's easy to interpret the
düşüvere
sentence
yazdım
now.
der teyze.
But
Düşüvere
for
yazdım.
instance, in Turkish,
Yani
an
bunu
old
bir
lady
cümleye
would say,
açtığımız zaman
I almost fell
öyle
down
bir
with one
düşecektim
single
ki az
word.
kalsın
I almost
ölebilirdim.
fell
Şöyle
down.
bir cümleyi
And it also
bir şey haline
means or
getirebilir.
implies
Bir
that
köylü
I
kadın.
could
Düşüvere
have died
yazdım.
if I had
Eylem
fallen
dilidir
down.
Türkçe.
But this is just one single word in
Hareket
Turkish.
halinde
So
olan
Turkish
bir.
is a
Bir de
is a language
yerleşik
of
olan
action.
din var.
It's a language of
Persin
mobility.
İran,
But there are also languages
Felsefede
of
mesela
settlement or
15.
being
yüzyıldan
settled like
sonra
Persian.
bütün İslam
Starting from the
tasavvuf
18th
felsefesi
century, the Islamic
Türkçe bilmiyor muydu Mevlana? Niye
Sufism
Farsça
shaped
yazdı?
the way
Çünkü o
people
dar
actually express
kapsıyordu onun
themselves.
şeyini.
Mevlana Celaleddin Rumi, for
Felsefe
instance,
dili,
wrote in Persian, although he
tasavvuf
could
dili
speak Turkish
ne
because
zaman
that
ki
English
dil
wrapped his
devrimiyle beraber
his
zaten devrim
work.
yıkıcı bir şey kendi
You know,
içinde.
revolution on
Yıkıp
its own
yeniden
is something
yapmaktır.
destructive because you destroy
Dolayısıyla
something and then
orada bir
start
feda
anew.
var. Bir şeyi
So
feda
you
etti.
actually
Bunun
sacrifice certain
travmasını
things, and we've
çekti.
sacrificed certain things in the
Zihinsel olarak
language
çekti.
revolution
Biz
as
daha
well,
kültürlü bir
and we
toplum
felt the
olabilirdik
trauma of this. We could have been a more
I
sophisticated
think
society.
we will stop here and we will have a break. If you have any further questions, I think our writers will be happy to talk to you on a one-to-one basis and answer your questions. Thank you very much for your wonderful, thought-provoking presentation and for your questions as well.